Okay, well, welcome everyone to today's Bible study. And this is Sabbath, December 3rd, 2022. And today we're going to talk about understanding the kingdom of Yahweh and the gospel message. And this may be part one of that. It's possible that we'll do a second part next week, because I'm not sure if I'm going to get through everything I wanted to get through today. But it's going to be a bit more about understanding the kingdom of Yahweh and the gospel message. So let's go to the biblical text, and we'll start out at Matthew 11, and we'll read verses 1 to 6. Matthew 11, verse 1. When Yahshua had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now, when John, while in prison, this is speaking, of course, of John the Baptizer, when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of Messiah, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Yahshua answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me." So John the Baptizer is a bit confused here, right? Here he was preaching with boldness, defying the current religious and political authorities. Remember the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. He's literally he's literally laying his life on the line for what he believed about a coming kingdom, which would to him represented a new form of rule, a new form of government, a new form of living for his people that would soon take place over the earth. And yet he's now in prison. So what's going on here, right? What is this? And he's John the Baptizer. He's the cousin of Yahshua, right? He seems to be having a bit of a crisis of faith. Are you the one, or should we be waiting for someone else? A crisis of belief. How could that be? Well, when you're in a position of in which John found himself, things aren't as clear cut as when everything is going well for you. And I'm sure that we all feel like that from time to time, that we, as worshipers of Yahweh, we feel that we're doing the best we can, or that we're leading lives that are dedicated to him. And then sometimes we find ourselves thinking, what's this all for? You try your best to live differently in a world that continually throws caution to the wind. And if you hold to religion at all, then people say, well, all religions lead to the same place. Don't worry about it. I'm spiritual, not religious, that kind of thing. You keep your truth, right? As if truth can be anything other than one particular thing, because it's either true or it isn't. But for us, we can't have that way of thought. We see things differently. We empathize and we try to best understand where others are coming from, but in the final analysis, we simply can't agree with that philosophy of living, because the scriptures say differently. The Bible says different. This is what we're supposed to believe. This is supposed to be what we do, isn't it? And then our reward for living according to these unfashionable biblical prescriptions and ideals are what? What is our reward? Is being ostracized and considered strange or weird in our day, old-fashioned, outdated, fanatical, out of touch, and in the eyes of some people even maybe dangerous, right? And we're increasingly marginalized in society, it seems, pushed closer and closer to the edge of irrelevance in a cancel culture society that would sooner drop us rather than listen to what we have to say or consider the message that we believe is the hope for all mankind. And in some places on earth, we here in the West, we typically are not in danger of losing our lives, typically, right? But in some places on earth, people actually will lose their lives because of their belief in the scripture. Sadly, it happens. So before we point an accusing finger at John, we have to ask ourselves, how do we in the present day with our faith reconcile our way of thinking sometimes with regard to what we say we believe and how we act according to that belief? In his day, facing the life-threatening situation in which he found himself, John was honest, right? John asked a very relevant question, which deserved an answer, right? Are you the one? And Yahshua provided the answer. And in doing that, he helped to allay John's fears, and he gave to him into John, and not only John, but also to his disciples, he gave them a better understanding of Yahweh's vision for the future, right? And he did that by giving him examples, illustrations of what he was doing. He didn't just come flat out and say, yes, I'm the one, right? Because that would be, that would just be on the nose. It's better to give John the evidence and his disciples the evidence and let them make up their minds as to whether what they're hearing is consistent with what the scriptures spoke of about a coming Messiah. And the problem, of course, is that, as tends to happen in life, we and they did not always have the complete picture. Sometimes we have a distorted picture. In our day, that's true, and it certainly was the case with John as well. So when you think about what people were expecting in terms of a Messiah, and let me point to one scripture here that's not in my notes, but I think it's illustrative of that. If you go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning with about verse 16. So I'll share that on screen here. So 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16, Paul says, therefore, from now on, we recognize no one according to the flesh. Even though we have known Messiah according to the flesh, yet now we know him in this way no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Messiah, he is a new creature. The old things passed away. Behold, new things have come. So he's describing a situation in which, in his time, they viewed the Messiah as being a certain way. And he's had to conclude, after seeing who Yahshua really is, he's had to conclude that that's not what Yahshua is about after all. So we have to look at him in a different way. And Yahshua, of course, is as the first who was resurrected, he is the first to represent what the new creation is all about. And that's ultimately what the kingdom of Yahweh and the gospel message are all about the institution of Yahweh's kingdom, which is going to be evidenced by new creation in every way. And starting with the new creation of human beings who were created in Yahweh's image and who saw corruption in the Garden of Eden. And now Yahshua comes as the first among many, many who are going to be resurrected. And he is the first that is resurrected. And eventually, in the course of time, when all things are fulfilled, then not only will there be a physical resurrection of humanity, but there will also be a recreation of the earth to restore it to a better condition than it was before. So even in Paul's day, there was a certain expectation of what the Messiah would be like and what the Messiah would be bringing. So that messianic vision was quite different than what John was expecting, right? What actually happened, what actually transpired was very different than what John was looking for, I guess is what I'm saying. So when we see John questioning Yahshua, his disciples, and let's go back to Matthew 11 so that we can see that, it sounds like he's doubting. It's not really that he's doubting, but he's concerned because he's not seeing what he expected. Are you the expected one, verse 2, or shall we look for someone else? And then Yahshua answers by giving him the evidence of what it is that he saw. You know what? I don't think I put that on screen. Sorry. There it is. Okay. So he says, are you the expected one, verse 3, or shall we look for someone else? And Yahshua said, go and report to John what you hear and see. And then he quotes to him from different scriptures. So if you go over to, I thought it might bring the verse up here, but I guess it doesn't. If you go to Isaiah 35, let me see if it'll bring it up. Yeah, there it is. Isaiah 35, verse 5. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the Arabah. And he continues speaking about the future and what it's going to look like when new creation occurs. So he's essentially telling John, here's your answer. Elements of new creation are being manifested in the world. The blind are receiving their sight, the lame are walking, lepers are cleansed, the deaf are hearing, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Don't miss out on that. And the poor have the gospel preached to them, right? So it's a reference to Isaiah 35, but it's also a lateral reference to Isaiah 52:7. And I should actually bring that out because that's important. It's key here. So Isaiah 52:7 says, how lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, your Elohim reigns. And then he goes on and he describes more. Break forth, verse 9, shout joyfully together, you waste places of Jerusalem, for Yahweh has comforted his people, he has redeemed Jerusalem. Yahweh has bared his holy arm in the sight of all the nations. It means he rolled up his sleeves to get the work done, that all the ends of the earth may see the salvation of our Elohim. And then I might also take you to Isaiah 40, verse 1. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your Elohim. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and call out to her that her warfare has ended, that her iniquity has been removed, that she has received of Yahweh's hand double for all her sins. A voice is calling, clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our Elohim. Let every valley be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And let the rough ground become a plain, and the rough, rugged terrain a broad valley. Then the glory of Yahweh will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of Yahweh has spoken. So I want you to notice here, let every valley be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low. Let the rough ground become a plain, the rugged terrain a broad valley. Clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for Elohim. Well, there are no highways in the desert, right? The desert is a wasteland. And valleys are supposed to be deep, not lifted up, right? Mountains are supposed to be high, not made low. And rough ground doesn't become a plain, right? So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is precisely much of what I like to convey today with regard to this gospel message. Everything is turned upside its head, right? The expectations that people have are turned upside their head, because Yahweh's ways are not their ways, right? People see things differently, and Yahweh ultimately is the one who makes the decision of how things are going to unfold. So I was just quoting Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. I'm not going to bring it up because it's taking me too long to get to it. So just listen, or you can look it up on your own there. Isaiah 55, verse 8, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So the way that Yahweh does things is going to be quite different sometimes the way that people envision it, because he's Elohim, he does it as he sees fit. So here John is expecting a certain thing because he's looking at the messianic vision, if you will, of the day. We saw that in the book of Revelation, right? Where people are looking, where John is looking, John the seer who gives the vision, he's looking in chapter 5 of the book of Revelation, and it says that he hears talk about who this person is, this one that is worthy, right, to open the scroll, and he hears terms that are associated with the messianic vision of the day, which is military terms, right? The Davidic Messiah. So in Revelation 5, verse 5, one of the elders said to me, stop weeping. Behold, the lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David. Those are strong messianic terms that convey a vision of a military conquering leader. So the lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, and that root of David, as you see that in Isaiah 11, among other places, has overcome so as to open the book in its 7 seals. So he heard this, right? One of the elders said to me, and he heard it, but then in verse 6, I saw. So he hears the elder refer to the lion from the tribe of Judah and the root of David, but then he sees something different. I saw between the throne with the four living creatures and the elders, a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of Elohim sent out into all the earth. So he hears something, which is the conventional wisdom, and it is true. He is the Lion of Judah, and he is the root of David. But the sight, the actual manifestation of that thing, is different than people's expectations. So he hears the military ruler, just like John is thinking, look, we're still under the oppression of the Romans. Why, how am I in prison, right? I've been preaching this strong message, and then we have someone who's going around, right? What is he thinking? He's thinking the conquering leader, not a man going around peacefully teaching and healing people, which is what he's hearing about. It's not that he disagrees with that. It's just that it's not his vision, right? It's not what the messianic vision is. He doesn't see, he's thinking, this is the time to replace false kings. Herod has to go, Caesar too, right? And the truth is that they will go, but not yet. He's thinking Israel restored to the glory days of David, right? Surely what they were living now was an indignity and a dishonor that had to be immediately corrected. But what was actually happening on the ground? Well, here's what was happening on the ground. A man going around, as I said, peacefully teaching and healing people, not a military conqueror. A meek, humble carpenter preaching, albeit with authority and firmly with authority. He wasn't weak by any stretch of the imagination, but he wasn't, putting down the Roman authorities. He sees a man healing the sick. He sees a man casting out demons. He sees a man eating with undesirables. So Yahshua is giving seemingly softer views of the Torah, even if you think about the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said this, but actually this. You've heard it said that, but actually that. So this is turning conventional expectations on their heads. How can this be? This is not at all what they were expecting. Well, as is often the case, it was a mix of right expectations and wrong thinking. So going back to Revelation 7, you have this vision. He's hearing about the line of Judah and the line of Judah and the root of David, which is absolutely correct. He's not hearing wrong. But what is the actual manifestation of the Lion of Judah? Is he going to be roaring like a lion? Well, maybe not the way that you think. Because then what he does is he sees the one who's actually conquering. And what does he see? He sees the lion? No, he sees a lamb. And not only that, a lamb standing as if it was slain, probably with his throat cut. It's similar to what you go, and then his people, he sees them the same way later, right? So before we go to that, he sees a little bit further down in verse 8. I'm in Revelation 5, verse 8. He sees the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, and they're all worshiping him. They sang a new song. Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for Elohim with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our Elohim, and they will reign upon the earth. So these are going to be his followers who are going to reign on the earth. So hold that image in your head and then move over to Revelation 11. And in Revelation 11, you have the 2 witnesses that are there, right, who are representatives of these people who are going to be worshiping and following in his footsteps. And then if you go further to Revelation 14, you have a similar situation, all right? You have a group of people. I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters. I'm in Revelation 14, verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice of which I heard was the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the living creatures and the elders. So I'm connecting this to chapter 5. And no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. So these are the ones who have been purchased from among all nations and tribes and peoples, etc. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to Elohim and to the Lamb. What are first fruits? Well, first fruits are the first the choice of the crop that comes up first in new creation, right? So these are the ones who are following in Yahshua's footsteps in the new creation of the kingdom of Yahweh. And no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. So he sees these people, and they're described as ones who have not, in verse 4, ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. Well, what is that a reference to? Well, that's a reference to Deuteronomy, the same ideas being conveyed as, and let me find the verse here. Deuteronomy 20. Okay, I can't find the particular verse in Deuteronomy at the moment, but you look at Deuteronomy, it's in the 20s somewhere. And then you look at other passages of scripture. For example, when you look at the history of the Israelites under Saul, you see that the soldiers who were going out to war were not supposed to lay with women, right? So if you go over to 1 Samuel 21, 1 Samuel 21, then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" And then he says, the king has commissioned me with a matter. He said, "Don't let anyone know where you're going." He's fleeing from Saul, of course. And verse 3, "Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found, because he and the men that are with him are hungry." The priest answered David and said, "There's no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women," right? So what is that? Well, that's a reference to the Torah, that they have to keep themselves from women when they're consecrated to go to war. So when you go back to Revelation 14, verse 4, this is a cultural reference to that abstention from sexual relations when they're going out to war. In other words, this is an image of a military contingent. So the 144,000, it is symbolism, right? And I'm not trying to rehash the whole book of Revelation again, but it all plays into what I'm discussing here about the kingdom, about the gospel, because the expectations are different. This is like a military regiment, and yet they are like their master, that they're sort of going as sheep to the slaughter. And there's more indication when you continue reading about who these people are, that they're not coming as military people at all. They're following in Yahshua's footsteps and conquering in the same way. They're not conquering through military conquest. They're conquering through love. They're conquering through compassion. They're conquering through the peaceful message of the gospel. That's how they are conquering. So it's it's always the expectations are being flipped upside their head, right? It's what you see in Isaiah 40, where it talks about the valleys made low, and the mountains, the valleys made brought high, and then the mountains made low. Everything is going upside down. Another example is Mark chapter 10, where the disciples are arguing, beginning right around 35. This is Mark 10:35. "James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Yahshua, saying, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.' And he said to them, 'What do you want me to do for you?' They said to him, 'Grant that we may sit, one on your right hand and one on your left, in your glory.' But Yahshua said to them, 'You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?' They said to him, 'We are able.'" They didn't really think through the full implications of that. And Yahshua said to them, "The cup that I drink, you shall drink." In other words, you are going to go through similar things that I did, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. They're thinking like human beings think with their political posturing and their office politics, right? The kind of things that you see out there, perhaps not to that degree, right? Because they knew better, I would think. But it's still, they're thinking about jockeying for position. Yahshua says, that's not the way we're going to do it. Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. That's verse 41. Calling them to himself, Yahshua said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be a servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." In other words, the Gentiles do that. They go around thinking that the way to exercise power is by going around and lording it over everyone, and exercising power in a way that that is tossing their weight around. And Yahshua said, that's not the way that we're going to do it. We're going to do it differently. We're going to do it by serving. That's how we're going to lead. We're going to be servants. And then he further brought that out in John 13 that we read every year on Passover time, which is when he himself went around washing the disciples' feet, right? And Peter didn't even want him to do it. And he said, I need to do this. I need to lead by example, in other words. So going back to John, is these expectations that he's turning upside their head. So we need to think in a deeper way about what Yahshua's message to John was. This is what you see, John. And I read you some of Isaiah 35, because it's also a message to us. It's a message about managing expectations and about hope, right? It's a message of truth, of a better future, of a new way of doing things. And that new way of doing things represents the kingdom of Yahweh. The kingdom, it sounds right, because we see movies, we don't have kingdoms anymore except in far away places like the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or the kingdom of, I don't know, what other remaining small kingdoms that exist out there. But a kingdom is we can refer to it as a government, right? It's the particular word doesn't really matter as much, but the idea is that it's a different way of ruling. It's government by Yahweh, right? It's his justice, it's his healing, it's his restoration, it's his peace coming to this earth. And that's the message of good news that's in the scriptures, or as we term gospel, right? And that comes from Isaiah 52, verses 7 to 10 that I read earlier about the good news. And where's the connection? Well, the good news is the Greek term euangelion, right? Which means good or true news. So you see that, for example, over in Galatians 1. So again, I'm not going to bring the verses up because it's just too disruptive. It takes too much time. So just kind of have your Bible handy, or you could just listen to me. So Galatians 1, beginning with verse 1. Paul, an apostle, not sent from men nor through the agency of man, but through Yahshua Messiah and Elohim the Father, who raised him from the dead. And it's interesting that he brings up immediately in Galatians that who raised him from the dead, because being raised from the dead is a hallmark of the gospel, of the kingdom, right? And all the brethren who are with me to the assemblies of Galatia, grace to you and peace from Elohim our Father and the sovereign Yahshua Messiah, who gave himself for our sins so that he might rescue us from this present evil age. So the idea is he's going to rescue us. What is another word for rescue? It's to save, right? He's going to rescue us. He's going to save us from this present evil age, according to the will of our Elohim and Father, to whom be the glory forevermore. I am amazed, verse 6, that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Messiah for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Messiah. And he goes on to say that if anyone brings another gospel than the one that we brought you, another type of good news, a counterfeit good news than the one that we brought you, then treat them as if they're outcasts, right? Because this is the only true good news. If you had a messenger who was bringing false news, you'd be in deep trouble, and that person would be considered to be a disruptor. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why they started using a calculated calendar at some point among the Jews, because there was a time when people would report the new moon from their location, and then they would convey that information to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And at some point, as things tend to happen, there were people who were sabotaging their efforts, and they would create a false witness. And the amount of time that it took to do that, by the time people heard the truth, the new moon had already passed, or they had the wrong new moon or whatever. So at some point they said, enough of this. We can't do this anymore. It's not like now that you could just pick up a phone, you can send someone a picture through your iPhone, right? Or you can get on Zoom and go and see something. Back then, obviously, they didn't have that. So although you had systems where you could do things, through beacons, for example, again, if you have a false witness who tampers with that, that's going to be a problem. And it's going to be very difficult to verify that. So You had to stop that. So with the gospel, you could have false conveyors of those messages as well. And so the term gospel is the Greek word euangelion, which is where we get the word evangel, right? That's what the word evangel means. So this term euangelion, true news, is what converts in to this word in Old English, gospel, right? So it's really, if you split those words apart, the words are good spell, like good, bad, right? Good, and then spell or spiel, right? Which is story. So it's or news. So when you hear people say, just speaking kind of slangy, they say, let me tell you my spiel, right? That's what they mean, right? Let me tell you my story. Let me tell you my news. So good spiel, good spell, it's gospel. It's just a contraction of that, and the word is gospel. I don't know, there are people that want to connect that to, some other stuff, and I'm just not going to go there because I don't see that. So it's good spiel, so gospel. So gospel is a perfectly legitimate word, and it means good news, but it's something very specific. Well, what is the gospel? Well, it actually comes from the Roman context, because that was the world of the apostles and Paul, right? Well, he was an apostle too. Their first century context was that of the Roman emperors, and when a new Roman emperor would come into power, they would send out the heralds. They would send out the messengers to announce that that emperor was going to be reigning. They'd send them throughout all of the lands that were ruled by Rome. And as you can imagine, it took some time to do that. So there's a bit of a lag between the time when the messenger is sent out and the messenger arrives at each successive location to let them know about the new coming king. So he may not have even entered into his office just yet. That he may still be cleaning up a war somewhere, right? Or he may have to get administrators together, or whatever the case may be. But they're announcing it because they're basically saying to everyone, giving advance notice, there's a new sheriff in town, right? There's a new ruler, and you guys better get yourselves ready, and you better get yourselves into ship shape, because he's coming to a town near you, and you need to be ready. Okay. So the gospel message is exactly that. That's the context. It's you see it, of course, in Isaiah 52 as well. It was common in the ancient world, but it has particular importance in the Roman context because of this gospel message that would be sent when an emperor would come into power. So essentially, this was a subversive message, right? And it's a subversive message because if you are proclaiming that there's a king and that king is one other than Caesar, what are you saying? Well, you're saying that if this Yahshua, who is a Jew, by the way, right? That's got to really, put the Romans in a happy mood. If this Jewish person is king, then what does that mean? It means that Caesar isn't, right? And this is why it was considered so dangerous and subversive. So if you look, for example, at this is of course the point behind the nice little ploy that they did over in Mark. Let me find this one here. Matthew 22:15. Matthew 22:15, and you know this story very well, this account. Then the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. And they sent their disciples to him along with their Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of Elohim in truth and defer to no one." And they're buttering him up, right? "For you are not partial to any." And of course, they're just trying to trap him, as it says in verse 15. "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not?" But Yahshua perceived their malice and said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax." And they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to Elohim the things that are Elohim's." And I want you to notice what's happening there, because on the surface, someone might use that count to say, well, in this world, you have a separation, and I'll just say how people say it, you have a separation between church and state. And that's, here's the basis of that, a separation of church and state. So, religious things, you just keep on the side, and state things, you keep them on the side. Now, in the ancient world, that was kind of ridiculous because everything was meshed together. There was no so-called separation of church and state. Everything was religiously involved like that. So that's an anachronistic idea, right? It's out of place. You might make a case for that today, but not really, for similar reasons, but we'll leave that alone for another day. But the point is that this was not what was being conveyed here, that there should be a separation between church and state, whatever that is, right? No. What he's saying to them is, this is Caesar's image on this coin, right? Human beings are created in the image of Elohim himself, right? So he's saying, give back to Caesar what truly belongs to him, which is just nothing more than the image, what's on the image of this coin. If that's what he wants, go ahead and give it to him. That's his. Obviously, it's his image on the coin, so he deserves what's his. But leave the rest to Elohim, essentially, is what's being said there. It's not saying, well, give some things to the Almighty, give some things to the state. No, he's making a statement that the one who I am proclaiming, in whose image all of you, including you Romans, are made, right? You're all subservient to him. You're all subject to him. So Caesar can have his little coin and anything that has his little, images on it, but everything else belongs to the one whose is the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? And everything else that exists in this universe. So yeah, feel free to give him the coin, right? And leave the rest to Elohim. And then when you think also about, so he's making this message that is, he's not trying to be subversive, but he's not holding back from it either. And then if you go over to Mark 11, verse 15, Mark 11:15, and I'll bring this one up because it's sort of a lengthy passage here. So verse 15, then they came to Jerusalem, and Yahshua entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den. The chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. So when they came to Jerusalem, he entered the temple, began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. So, so the common thought is that he was just, going against the commercialism of the temple, right? And there's truth to that. He was in fact doing that, and he quoted Jeremiah as he was doing it. Okay, but was that all he was doing? No. And I didn't keep reading, but he talks about the fig tree shortly after that. And there are other things in constellation. When you have different things in the associative field of a particular text, you have to look at all those things to see what's going on. Yahshua is, and just a few chapters later, in Mark, actually not a few chapters later, in 2 chapters later, is the Olivet prophecy, right? What Yahshua is doing there is he is enacting, he's doing a play. He's reenacting something, as the prophets tended to do, right? So if you remember it as, and this is not the best example, but if you remember one example in the prophets that, somebody goes and tears, he grabs a hold of one of the skirts of one of the prophets and it tears. And as a matter of fact, it happened with Samuel and Saul. Saul went over to him and he tore Samuel's robe. Let me see if I can find that over in 1 Samuel. This is 1 Samuel 27. 1 Samuel 15:27. You can just listen. 1 Samuel 15:27. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe and it tore. So Samuel said to him, so he's looking at this, he sees the thing tear. He says, Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. It's that kind of thing, right? Is the prophet breaking breaking a jar or something and saying, this is, the kingdom's been shattered today or something like that, right? Or the one guy in Kings where he shoots the arrows and, and there's a prophetic message about the arrows that are shot, or he strikes them on the ground. Remember that? It's that kind of thing. That's what Yahshua is doing in the temple. He is essentially saying, this temple is coming down, right? He's not trying to do a violent overthrow or anything like that. It's nothing like that. It's a symbolism, right? It's like, I'm overturning the tables. The temple is going to be thrown down. It's going to be thrown down by your enemies. And then a couple of chapters later in 13, he says it plainly, right? There's not going to be a single stone left here that's not going to be overturned. So he's talking about the overthrow of the temple system, because people are relying on the temple, and they're saying, the temple of Yahweh is the Jeremiah message. In other words, as long as this temple is here, we're going to be just fine. Doesn't matter how we're living, mind you. Doesn't matter that we're doing everything, against the Torah. But as long as the temple is here, Yahweh's here with us, the Spirit's with us, and everything. No, doesn't work that way, right? So Yahshua is saying, this temple that you've come to rely on as your salvation, as if this is your symbol of what is right, has nothing to do with this temple. It's how your heart is towards Yahweh. It's Ezekiel, where the Spirit of Yahweh literally departs from the temple, right? Because of the same reasons. So he's enacting this, that the temple is going to be overthrown because there's a better kingdom that's coming. This temple is not going to represent the worship of Yahweh. It's not going to represent his rule here. There's something deeper that's happening here. It's the true governing of Yahweh. Yahweh is going to be in the midst of a people that loves and honors him. It's a return to Genesis. It's a return to Genesis 1 and 2, where Yahweh creates a temple in chapter 1. Every stage there of creation of the earth is the parallel of a creation of a temple. And then the very last thing that he does is he sits on the Sabbath, and now he rests and he watches over his creation, and he rules over them. And if you look at the book of Exodus, that's exactly what happens at the end of the book of Exodus, right? So if you go to Exodus 40, and this is all tied together. It's the plan of salvation being reenacted again and again, right? Except with different symbols. In Exodus, it's done with a physical symbol of the temple, and now in Yahshua's case, is being done with his temple, with his body, which is the temple, because he is the true temple, right? So if you go to Exodus 40, verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory, and of course, at that time was a tabernacle. It was portable, but it's the equivalent of the temple. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. This is Yahweh returns to Israel, right? It's returning to Eden. It's return from exile. You were sent out in exile, sent out of Eden to be among the nations and to be trampled by the nations. And now Yahweh has guided you lovingly with compassion. He's guided you back to his peace. He's guided you back to his comfort. He's guided you back to his kingdom. He's guided you back to Eden, where now you can have intimacy with him once again, as he meets with you in the garden and loves you. And then that's how they end the book of Exodus. They've gone, Yahweh rescues them out of Egypt, and now he brings them back to their own place so that they can worship. And of course, the next stage would be literally the promised land, and that doesn't happen until many, many years later because of their sin, right? But it's the same, it's the story of the entire Bible is a move back to the intimacy of Eden. And that's what the kingdom of Yahweh represents. Let me give you a couple of other verses about the gospel, which is announcing that king. And that would be, one of them would be Romans chapter 1. And Paul says, just like he did over in Galatians, Paul, this is Romans 1, Paul, a bondservant of Messiah, Yahshua, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of Elohim. There it is. So he's set apart to bring the good news of Elohim. To whom? Mainly to the Gentiles, not just to the Gentiles, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile, right? Which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, right? Set apart for the gospel of Elohim, which he promised beforehand. What which he promised? The gospel which he promised, the good news which he promised. How? Through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, right? Concerning his son. So all the message of, so the centrality of the gospel, which is the message of the king, is the king, right? So the good news is, what's the good news? The good news is the king is here. The king is here. The kingdom is here. The kingdom is established, okay? And we are in a mop-up operation. Just like I said, he would send, when the Roman emperor was put into power, the Roman emperor wasn't in those territories yet. But it was as good as if he were, because it was being proclaimed throughout all the territories of the empire. Now all you were doing were making the reparations and the repairs and setting up the administrative precincts and everything else, because you didn't do that when the king was already there. You did it before, so that when he got there, it's all ready to go, right? And in the meantime, there may be some in parts of the kingdom who didn't get the memo, right? And some of them are still fighting. And then, then you got to send in some legions to go ahead and take care of that, because they obviously didn't get the memo. Okay, now we're going to show them, here's the memo, right? You're done. And they got to clean that up. Same thing that's happening today with regard to Yahshua. He is already king. It's just that there's a mop-up operation. And I've explained this several times, but I want to keep on emphasizing this, that we all understand that, are we living, right? We have to know, are we living as if our king is here? So if you go over to Matthew 28, and you can hold your place in Romans, since we're not done there yet. But if you go over to Matthew 20, that's not, I don't want 28, 126. Matthew 26:62, the high priest stood up and said to him, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But Yahshua kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living Elohim, that you tell us whether you are the Messiah, the son of Elohim. Yahshua said to him, you have said it yourself. Nevertheless, or you have said it. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So this word here, hereafter, well, that's just an old, a fancy schmancy, translational word here that's put in a translational word, a word that's in translation that means from this time on, from now on, in plain English of today, right? He says, I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. This is the language of Daniel 7. So he's saying to him, from this point forward, in other words, with my death and with my resurrection, you're going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. What is the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power? That's the Son of Man reigning with Yahweh, right? And that's, like as I said, that's Daniel 7. What happens in Daniel 7? In Daniel 7, the evil powers, they do their thing. They are doing their utmost to destroy the reign of Yahweh on this earth, and they're defeated. So if you go over to Daniel 7, beginning with around verse 13, and actually we could start with 9 for context. This is Daniel 7, verse 9. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. That's Yahweh. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him. This is like Revelation 4, Revelation 5. And myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat and the books were open. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. The horn is this, this end time beast that is described similarly in the book of Revelation. I kept looking until the beast was slain. It's even referred to as a beast here. And its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, because there is more than one, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Then with verse 13, the tide starts to turn. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And this is the illusion that Yahshua is this is what Yahshua is alluding to in Matthew 26. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and the kingdom. By the way, he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. He was lifted up before him. How did that happen? On the throne. What is the throne? What is the throne? What was Yahshua's initial throne? It was a cross, right? So this is John 12. Okay, by this time you've run out of fingers, so just follow me, just hear my voice. He says to them, the hour has come. This is John 12:23. And Yahshua answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, speaking of his martyrdom, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And then a little bit further down, he says in verse 31, now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. That's similar to the powers that you see here in Daniel 7. So Satan has been doing his utmost to destroy. And then in verse 32, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. The crowd that answered him, we have heard out of the law that the Messiah is to remain forever. And how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is the Son of Man? And then he continues speaking about that, and he gives you more. But the idea is that he's going to be lifted up. This is, again, is still Daniel language, but once again, he's flipping things upside his head. So the Messiah that John is looking for is this conquering Messiah that comes on the charger, right, for war. And instead what he sees is a crucified Messiah, right? He doesn't see that, but that's what's on its way, right? Everything that he's seeing is the opposite of what was the expectation. So Yahshua had to calm him down and say, hey, this is what Isaiah says. Remember, this is what's supposed to happen when the Messiah comes. Forget, the idea is don't be looking for all this military stuff. Look at what Isaiah said. Isaiah said that, that the waters were going to be flowing and that the blind would be healed and the deaf would be healed and the lame would walk, right? These are the things of which a kingdom consists, not of military conquest. People have that all wrong. I'm not saying that military conquest is not a necessity and protection and all that, because that happens too, but that's not the way the earth is going to be redeemed. The earth is going to be redeemed through love. It's going to be redeemed through compassion. It's going to be redeemed through healing of all sorts. It's going to be relieved. It's going to be redeemed by relieving people of the demons and all the things that have been trying to destroy them. In other words, the same way that this ruler was redeemed, everyone else is going to be redeemed as well, right? This is Daniel 7. I kept looking in the night visions in 7:13, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. Yahshua is raised up on the worst thing. It's like he's bringing all evil to himself. He's subject to all the elements of the world. When we say he's taken upon, it's Isaiah 53 stuff. He's taking all the evil and all the pain of the world onto his shoulders. All the elemental spiritual forces, economic forces, social forces, political forces. These forces represent idolatry, right? All the idolatrous forces that have been destroying this earth. He takes them. He draws them to himself. Where? At the cross. That's where at his ascension, at his enthronement, he brings it all together and he says, bring it at me, right? Bring it all here, bring it. All these forces attempt to usurp the authority of Yahweh. They usurp the authority and the impact of the only one true force that matters. And instead of that, once he brings them all together, he kills it at the cross. And instead of that, we are governed and directed by a righteous rule, by the one who has the authority and the right to lead us. And that's the way he does it. On the throne, the worst death that the Romans could consider for humanity, for human beings, that instrument that is such a shame and a disgrace for anyone who's on it, that very thing is what he uses to be raised up and to ascend to the throne. So he's lifted up, truly, literally lifted up and enthroned. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve. And by the way, I'm just scratching the surface. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And he goes and he continues describing all these different kingdoms, right? And by the way, this is all culmination of the story in Daniel up till now, because the things that came before were leading to this climax in Daniel 7. Matter of fact, Daniel 6, which is the story of Daniel in the lion's den, it's a direct parallel, because what happens, Daniel he's in the den, which is in the depths of the earth, right? And the beasts are descending upon him. Okay, the lions, ironically enough, because Yahshua is the Lion of Judah, right? So the lions are about to destroy him. And just when you think that there's no hope and that the lions are going to destroy him, he's raised up, right? And they can't do anything. They can't touch him. May Elohim send his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me. And Daniel spoke to him in Daniel 6:21. He spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My Elohim sent his angel and shut the lion's mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. He's ascended out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found in him, because he had trusted in his Elohim. You see, same thing. It's all through the Bible, my friends. Book of the story of Joseph. Where was Joseph? His brothers sell him, and after they throw him in a pit, and he's brought up out of the pit and sold into slavery in Egypt. It's the exile, right? And then, while in Egypt, he's thrown into the dungeon. It's over. It's like Yahweh gave us account after account after account to show his plan of salvation and how he brings his chosen one out to bring salvation to everyone else. So he takes Joseph out of the pit of the dungeon. Once again, he takes him out the first time, and the first time he sends him out into Egypt, and Egypt does everything that it can to him, until the point where Yahweh says it's time. He pulls him out of the dungeon. He elevates him in the sight of Pharaoh, right? And now he becomes the one who becomes a savior for the rest of his people and everybody else. It's all over the scriptures, all over the scriptures. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop here. I'm gonna do some more, Yahweh willing, next week. So hopefully this has made some sense. But I want to talk a little bit more about the temple and about reunification of heaven and earth and some other things as well. And I'll get to that, Yahweh willing, next week. Okay, are there any questions about anything?